Good morning and welcome to this week's edition of History Comes Alive. I'm your host, John Maietta, and today we're going to be visiting one of my favorite cities, the city of Vienna, Austria. My wife and I honeymooned in Vienna in 1971. I actually got college credit for my honeymoon. Let me explain this briefly. So I was going to Bucknell University in upper northern Pennsylvania, and they had a semester program in between semesters. In January, you could take time off for independent study, and one of the professors was offering a month-long program on the history and culture of Vienna. So we went along, myself, my wife, about 20-some students, and 3 chaperones on my honeymoon. And we stayed at a lovely rooming house in Vienna, a pension, and we visited Vienna again it's been about 15 years, and the pension is still there, although we actually upgraded our accommodations a little bit. So for those of you who have never been to Vienna, or those of you who have and maybe want to relive some memories, this is a good opportunity to do that. And the slide on the screen shows one of the most iconic views of Vienna. It's from the observatory near the top of Stephansdom, St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, the symbol of the city. There you see the magnificent tiled roof, and we're looking out over the old historic district of central Vienna. So here we go, starting with a discussion briefly about the elegance and grandeur of Vienna. One of its most striking characteristics, the travel writer Bill Bryson remarked, "A Martian coming to Earth would unhesitatingly land in Vienna, thinking it to be the capital of the planet." And you certainly get a sense of that when you look at the magnificent imperial buildings. Like on the left is the ornate main gate of Belvedere Palace, and on the right is the dome and altar of St. Peter's Church, St. Peter's Kirche, Baroque church modeled on St. Peter's in Rome. The Viennese have been known to say that our streets are surfaced with culture as the streets of other cities are surfaced with asphalt. And that's certainly on offer for tourists and citizens of Vienna alike. However, there is another side to life in Vienna, illustrated by those street musicians on the left. Sentimentality, a sense of nostalgia, kitsch, or in a word, schmaltz. And the Viennese also have adopted a very light-hearted approach to life. Concept of wine, women, and song, practically invented in Vienna. Franz Lehár, a Viennese composer, wrote a couple of operettas featuring pretty girls, champagne, happy endings, including, of course, The Merry Widow, shown here. He wrote another operetta, less well-known, called The Land of Smiles. That very much describes the gestalt, or the feeling, among the Viennese. Viennese also like to make fun of themselves. They don't take things too seriously. In fact, they have a delightful phrase, I quote, "The situation is hopeless, but not serious." And even outside observers have a mixed view of Vienna. The German composer Richard Strauss said that, quote, "People are two-faced everywhere, but in Vienna they are so pleasantly two-faced." So we see this, again, sense of not taking oneself too seriously, a certain degree of irony among the Viennese. The Viennese are also fond of tradition, and they have a lot of it. Almost 2,000 years of continuous civilization at Vienna. The image here shows Vienna around 1600, and you can see some recognizable landmarks, including, of course, there's St. Stephen's, Stephansdom, then as now the symbol of the city with its magnificent spire. And these old medieval walls here that define the city early in its history were torn down in the 19th century, and in their place, the Ringstrasse, the Ring Boulevard, took the place of those walls and really defines the old historic district of Vienna. Note here in the foreground, the Danube River, fabled in story and song, suggests to historians the long history of east-west trade that passed through Vienna from Central Asia into the Black Sea, and then from the Black Sea up the Danube into the heart of Europe. The Danube also has very romantic associations with the Viennese, but most of the time it's been a headache for its periodic floods. In the 17th century, the Danube was described as great and cruel, but Johann Strauss, again reflecting that sense of Viennese irony, I think, he made the Danube beautiful and blue in his waltz, The Beautiful Blue Danube, although I have to tell you, most of the time the Danube is brown, not blue. Well, the first century Romans established a military camp at the site of what became Vienna. They called it Vindobona, which means white base. Not sure why they gave it that name, but by the 3rd century AD, the population of Vindobona was around 20,000 people. Here's an illustration in the Viennese City Museum of a typical street in Roman Vienna, and here on the right, actual excavations underway in the city to uncover its distant past. The Romans withdrew in the 5th century. Then, for the next 5 centuries, a number of Germanic tribes or confederations of tribes, the so-called barbarians, invaded the region in and around Vienna. In the year 955, Otto I, a successor to Charlemagne, defeated the last foreign invaders. They were actually Magyars from Hungary, defeated them, ousted them, and established a kingdom of Austria. Here he is depicted in a famous equestrian statue from 1240. After Otto I, then, German princes ruled the region for the next 300 years. Stephansdom, St. Stephen's Cathedral, dates from this early medieval period, and you can see again how it dominates the city. This excerpt or snapshot from a painting is from about 1490, and you can see again the spire, the tiled roof, and in the foreground, of course, the ever-present Danube River. However, most of the building of Stephansdom dates from the 14th, 15th century in this characteristic Gothic style. By the way, there are about 250,000 tiles, glazed tiles on the roof. They were destroyed in World War II, and they've been magnificently replaced. Here's the view inside Stephansdom, looking down the 350-foot interior all the way to the high altar here in the background. And on the left is one of the master craftsmen who built Stephansdom. Typical example of Viennese wit. Anton Pilgrim carved himself into the stonework below the organ. He's shown here holding the tools of his trade, a square and a compass here. So he's ensuring that his contribution to the magnificent building will be available to see for all of history. As did a colleague of his, another craftsman, we don't know if it's Pilgrim or somebody else, carved himself peeking out of a fake window down at the bottom of this magnificent pulpit. This Gothic pulpit shows 4 fathers of the ancient church. One is on the back side, carved in 1515 to adorn the interior of Stephansdom. Well, you can't appreciate Vienna or Austria without talking about the Habsburgs, one of the most influential royal houses in European history. In 1278, a German prince, Count Rudolf I of Habsburg, defeated the King of Bohemia and took over Austria, founding the Habsburg dynasty with its seat in Vienna. And the Habsburg dynasty lasts for 640 years, quite a record, through some very turbulent times. Rudolf also, as do his successors, they take over the role of Holy Roman Emperor, which is, the Holy Roman Empire was a confederation of German-speaking regions in Europe. So as Holy Roman Emperor, Rudolf and the rest of the Habsburgs gain symbolic authority over all ethnic German territory in Central and Eastern Europe. 138 members of the royal family, of the Habsburg family, are buried in the Imperial crypt in the Capuchin Church in Vienna. This happens to be the tomb of one of them, Maria Theresa, who I'll talk about shortly, from the 18th century. Now, here's a caveat though. If you are actually an emperor or empress in the Habsburg line, your tomb in the Capuchin Church only holds your main body parts. The emperor's hearts were removed and placed in silver vessels in the Augustinerkirche, another noted church in Vienna, and their entrails, what remains in the body cavity, placed in copper urns under Stephansdom. So they've maintained a scattered presence throughout the city of Vienna. How appropriate. Well, in the 1500s, the Habsburgs established marriage ties with Spain, with Burgundy, later with Bohemia. They have a motto in the family: let others make war. You, fortunate Austria, marry. And so as a result of these marital alliances, by 1555, Habsburg rule extends in all of these green areas: Eastern, Central Europe, Southern Italy, Spain, and present-day Netherlands. And the Habsburg domains extend even to the New World, which they inherit through the Spanish side of their family, beginning with the Spanish conquests in the late 1400s. The last Holy Roman Emperor is Franz II. He retains that title up until 1806. That's when Napoleon occupies Vienna, and he says there is room for only one emperor in Europe, and that happens to be Napoleon. However, the Habsburgs continue as the emperors of Austria until 1918, when they abdicate at the end of World War I. This is the primary residence of the Habsburg dynasty, the Hofburg Palace, literally the castle of the court, complex of buildings in central Vienna, the seat of the Habsburg government for 600 years, holds state apartments, several museums, a chapel, the offices of the current president of Austria, the Imperial Treasury, where you can see the crown jewels. And the forecourt of the Hofburg is a good place to hire a fiacre. These are Viennese horse-drawn carriages, a great way to see the city in kind of a traditional style, take photographs, and have yourself photographed as you clip-clop through the ancient streets of Vienna. Within the Hofburg complex is the Spanish Riding School, founded in 1572 to promote classic horsemanship skills, so important for the Viennese nobility. The name Spanish Riding School comes from the horses and the style of riding that was imported from Spain when those Spanish dominions were acquired to Habsburg territory. Later, beginning around 1600, these horses, originally from Spain, were raised on an imperial stud farm in the town of Lipica in Slovenia, which is how they became known as Lippensaner stallions. Shown on the left is an 18th century horse ballet in the riding school, and of course this is the building as it still remains with these viewing galleries, the horses and the riders down here in the pit. And here's a present-day close-up of one of the horses performing a classic step called the levade, a great test of the grace and stamina of the horses as well as the uniformed riders. Also in the Hofburg Palace in 1498, Emperor Maximilian I founded the Vienna Boys Choir to sing in his chapel. The boys' choir continues today. There are about 100 members of the chorus, boys aged 9 to 14, mostly from Austria, but drawn from other countries as well. And in the pre-corona virus period, they divided themselves up into 4 touring choirs, offering 300 performances a year around the world. Hopefully they'll be back in business perhaps next year. In the 17th century, the Emperor Leopold I was a big spender at the Hofburg Palace complex. Example of this came in 1667 when he married a Spanish princess, celebrated the occasion with a lavish display of 80,000 fireworks set off from 2 artificial mountains constructed on the grounds of the Hofburg Palace gardens. This engraving of the spectacle shows here, probably hard for you to see, but the letters A-E-I-O-U are illuminated by the fireworks. That's a motto for the Habsburg dynasty. It's an acronym for a German phrase that means all the world is subject to Austria, being celebrated here in 1667. Occasionally, external threats interrupt the good life at court in Vienna. In 1529, the Ottoman Turks laid siege to Vienna during their drive to expand westward, driven off by bad weather, however, but they return in 1683. A much bigger effort, and although it's tempting to view this invasion of Viennese territory as a clash of civilizations between Christianity and Islam, in fact, it was more in the nature of big power politics. France and Italy supported the Ottoman invasion of Austria as a way to weaken Austria. Both France and Italy provided advisors to help the Ottoman government and military plan their campaign strategy. And the Ottoman forces from Turkey included Christian allies from Hungary who took part in the siege of Vienna in 1683. The siege eventually was unsuccessful, but it brought us coffee. And there's a story told that this siege of Vienna was the entry point for coffee into European society. The story goes that when the Ottoman army had vacated their camp outside the city of Vienna, the Viennese went out to examine what they left behind and found sacks of coffee beans. And they soon figured out what to do with them, whether the story is true or not. The first coffee house in Vienna, the Blue Bottle, opened in 1686. These coffee houses in Vienna, as throughout Europe, provided a home away from home, especially for men. They became fashionable centers for intellectual discussion, political debate, and manly camaraderie. And the Viennese have a saying, a coffee house is where you go when you want to be alone. But to do that, you have to have people around you. Another quirky Viennese saying. So in fact, each coffee house in Vienna has a distinctive style, distinctive clientele. I'm featuring one of the most famous here, the Café Central. The patrons at this famous coffee house included Leon Trotsky, the leader of the Red Army during the Russian Revolution, the playwright Hugo von Hofmannsthal, and a struggling Austrian artist named Adolf Hitler, all frequent customers here at the Café Central. And all of them, no doubt, enjoyed this traditional Viennese favorite, Kaffee mit Schlag, or coffee with unsweetened whipped cream, in this case really made fancy with the addition of a cookie, a glass of water as a chaser, and those of you who've been to Vienna know that once you've bought your cup of coffee, your coffee drink, by custom you can spend all day in the coffee house reading free newspapers. Or I suppose now they have Wi-Fi so you can glean the news on your mobile device. Well, after the Turkish threat is gone by the late 17th century, the Enlightenment prevails in Vienna as it does all over Europe. This intellectual, philosophical movement devoted to ideals of religious tolerance, liberty, restraint on the power of monarchs, and this concept of progress. One Enlightenment ruler in Vienna was the Empress Maria Theresa, shown here. She ruled, reigned from 1740 to 1780. Quite a large family. She was the only child of the Emperor Karl VI, and again, by tradition, she couldn't rule in her own right as empress since she was a woman. So she ruled jointly with her husband and later ruled jointly with her son, Joseph II. But there's no doubt that she, Maria Theresa, ran things in Vienna and in the empire as a whole. She introduced a number of enlightened policies to the people of Vienna and Austria. She introduced compulsory education, tax reform, health and welfare programs, and she showed the scientific spirit of the Enlightenment age. At one point, she sent a doctor to Moravia to investigate rumors of vampires. She's an autocrat with a common touch. She rules her people like a stern but loving mother. It was said by her, the Viennese will do anything if talked to kindly and shown affection. She even paid a promised settlement to her husband's mistress after he died, the soul of generosity. Her son, Joseph II, ruled from 1780 to 1790, also progressive, especially regarding religious views. And he carried this notion of portraying the common style even further. Here's a painting of him in full regalia behind a plow. This looks like an early version of a photo op, the kind we see during political campaigns. But there he is pretending to plow behind a horse to gain sympathy, I guess, among the hoi polloi, the average Viennese. His favorite dish, nothing fancy, no fancy French cuisine for him. His favorite dish was boiled beef, a traditional Viennese meal. At one point, one of his subjects tried to kiss his hand, and he said, "I am not a sacred relic." He commissioned an opera from Mozart, The Abduction from the Seraglio, and complained after he heard it performed. He said, "This music is too fine for my ears. There are too many notes." To which Mozart reportedly replied, "There are just enough notes as there should be." Joseph II carried his common ways too far on occasion. For example, at one point he was thrown out of a Viennese brothel. The owner didn't recognize him and objected to the way he was handling the merchandise. Well, tourists in Vienna can see the grand style of living among the ruling class. This is Schönbrunn Palace, originally the summer home for the Imperial family. Started in 1695 by that big spender Leopold I on the site of a former hunting lodge. Here you see in the photograph a portion of the gardens and fountains in the foreground. You can also see at Schönbrunn a zoo, a tropical greenhouse, and some fake Roman ruins. Maria Theresa completed Schönbrunn in the mid-18th century, lived here with her 16 children, including Marie Antoinette. And this young lad here is none other than a young Mozart who played at the Viennese court as a young lad, reportedly sat on the lap of Maria Antoinette, said he wanted to marry her. Unfortunately, she lost her head in the French Revolution before Mozart had that opportunity. Here on the left is the Great Gallery, an example of the ornate interior of Schönbrunn. This was a former site for imperial banquets, and until 1984, location for official Austrian state receptions. Here's the upper half of Belvedere Palace, another stop on the tourist trail. This is one of two palaces linked by fountains and formal gardens. This was built in the early 1700s as another summer home. This happened to be a summer home for Prince Eugene of Savoy, who gained fame during the defense of Vienna against the Ottoman Turks. On the right is one of the two famous statues of a sphinx, half lion, half woman, a symbol of strength plus intelligence, deemed a good image for the imperial family. Vienna's nobility did not stint in their devotion to spiritual matters as well as secular pleasures. Here is one of the most famous churches in Vienna, besides Stephansdom. It's Karlskirche, the Karl's Church, commissioned by Maria Theresa's father, Emperor Karl VI, after a plague epidemic struck Vienna in 1713. The church honors St. Charles Borromeo, the patron saint of plague victims. And a striking feature of this church are these two columns, inspired by Trajan's column in Rome, that show scenes from the life of the saint spiraling around them. Very lavish, dramatic interior, typical of the Baroque architectural style in the 1700s. The altar here may be hard for you to see, but the altar shows St. Charles being lifted up to heaven on a cloud, along with a band of angels singing. By the latter part of the 18th century, Vienna was peaceful, prosperous, sophisticated. Here's a painting from the School of Canaletto, one of those urban views so popular in the mid-1700s. You can see, obviously, here's Stephansdom, St. Stephen's Cathedral. Here's the Karlskirche that we just talked about. And over here are the Belvedere Gardens, just to orient you in this very accurate painted depiction of the city at a point in time. Vienna was the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, as I said, and a center of the European music and cultural scene. With all the wealth and culture concentrated in Vienna, it's no surprise that musical talent flourished in Vienna, at least when composers could get support from their rich friends and imperial patrons. One emblem of Vienna's later music life is the main concert hall in the city. The Musikverein, the Music Society, opened in 1870, seats 2,000 patrons. It's the home of the Vienna Philharmonic. And the musicians, considered so important to the well-being of the city, that they are full-time government employees. Wouldn't it be great if our arts organizations in this country could be sustained by full-time permanent government appropriations? Not going to happen anytime soon. Well, among the many famous composers who lived and worked in Vienna, the boy wonder Mozart, and I found this wonderful painting of him as a young lad. He was born in Salzburg in western Austria, but lost his job as a teenage musician at the court and settled in Vienna, where he sought fame and fortune. Well, he found fame in his lifetime. He wrote over 600 works in a relatively short period of time, but he didn't find much fortune. The emperor appointed him composer in residence, but cut his pay from half of what it had been paid to his predecessor. And he compounds his problems by poking fun at the nobility of Vienna in operas such as The Marriage of Figaro. And he's also undone by a scheming Italian claque put up by his rival composer Antonio Salieri. And those of you who have seen the movie Amadeus know how this rivalry between Mozart and Salieri was dramatized. Mozart died of fever at age 35, and sadly, he ended up in a pauper's grave in Vienna. Franz Schubert was born in Vienna, equally prolific as Mozart, but totally neglected by the public. He survived on private support from a small circle of friends. He died even younger than Mozart, age 31, possibly poisoned by mercury, which he took to treat syphilis. Ludwig van Beethoven, born in Bonn, Germany, later spent 36 years, the last 36 years of his life in Vienna, forced to move 25 times while he lived in Vienna due to problems with his landlords and creditors. In fact, Beethoven's life is a continuous series of torments from financial, emotional, even family problems. On the right is a sketch of Beethoven later in life in a cafe. When he went out for meals, you notice he's eating alone. When he went out for meals, the proprietors of the cafes would put him alone in a back room where his wild gestures and rude behavior wouldn't offend other customers. However, his reputation as a temperamental, eccentric genius probably attracted a good degree of the patronage he enjoyed from the admiring elite of Viennese society. Beethoven's problems getting along with people were undoubtedly made worse by his difficulty hearing, a tragic problem for a composer. The symptoms first appeared when he was 30 years old. By the time he died at age 56, he was stone deaf. But every spring he could find some solitary comfort, escaping the stress and clamor of the city, and wandering, as in this painting, wandering through the wooded hills outside Vienna. Those bucolic scenes worked on his imagination, and he gives those scenes a musical shape in his famous pastoral symphony, Symphony No. 6. I want to play two very short excerpts from the symphony. You'll hear first a kind of an ambling, walking motif, as though Beethoven himself is walking through the woods. Then his reveries are interrupted by woodwinds in the orchestra imitating birds, including probably the most famous cuckoo in the musical repertoire. So here we go, two very short excerpts from Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. Franz Joseph Haydn was probably the happiest of the lot among Viennese composers. He was a longtime employee of the wealthy Esterházy family at a country estate away from Vienna. And in the photograph on the right, that's him on the right, he's leading a string quartet in one of the 83 string quartets that he wrote. He's often considered the father of the string quartet. He also wrote 108 symphonies, loads of other works. Late in his life, Haydn settled in Vienna, where for a time he taught composition to the up-and-coming Beethoven. He died peacefully in Vienna at the ripe old age of 77. Figuratively, the music stops briefly in Vienna with the arrival of Napoleon. In 1805, Napoleon invades Austria. He occupies Vienna. That's depicted in the painting here. And there, of course, is our iconic Stephansdom. The emperor's advisor, Prince Metternich, arranges for Napoleon to marry the emperor's favorite daughter, Marie-Louise. she gives him his only legitimate son, and actually his only legitimate child at all, who sadly dies at age 21 at Schönbrunn Palace. Beethoven initially admired Napoleon as a champion of liberty and social reform. He originally dedicated his Third Symphony to Napoleon, but after Napoleon had himself declared emperor in 1804, Beethoven tore up the dedication page for his symphony. Here's a copy of that manuscript. You can see where the name of Napoleon has been erased so hard the paper has been destroyed. Beethoven retitled his Third Symphony a heroic symphony composed to celebrate the memory of a great man. And we'll leave it to speculation as to what great man he is referring to, maybe Beethoven himself. And that's where the Third Symphony gets the nickname the Eroica Symphony. In 1814, Napoleon was finally defeated at Waterloo. The great powers of Europe convened to divide up Napoleon's empire, restore the status quo. At the Congress of Vienna, 1814-1815, the conference was organized by this man. Here is Prince Metternich, imperial advisor to the emperor. And that's him, I'm quite sure, depicted here as sort of the orchestrator of this carving up of Europe among various other crowned heads in Europe. From the end of the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Austria becomes a virtual police state. Metternich becomes the Chancellor of Austria, working hand in hand with the emperor, institutes censorship, political activity is banned. The emperor remarks at the time, "I do not need scholars, I need well-behaved citizens." And that was Metternich's role to ensure. Popular unrest and an economic downturn, not only in Vienna but all across Europe, led to a series of revolutions. In 1848, students, workers, and middle-class reformers made relatively modest demands for free speech, representative government. Metternich and his emperor at the time, Frederick I, panic in the face of this public unrest, and they flee the city very sensibly. However, within 6 months, the Austrian army, shown here, has recaptured the barricades, retaken the city, and the revolution fails. Metternich and the emperor, however, do not return to the city of Vienna. Well, despite this periodic turbulence among the common folk, the 19th century is a time when Viennese could express their concept of the good life. With limited political freedom, they enjoyed what they called happiness in a quiet corner, in the home, as depicted in this painting. Family values, homely values, everything is in good order, quiet, calm. And in the 18th century, there's something more lively going on in the realm of entertainment in Vienna, the waltz. First popularized by Johann Strauss Sr., the waltz took hold in Vienna to the point that by the mid-century, mid-19th century, 1/4 of the adult population of Vienna were in music or dance school. At the time, the German composer Richard Wagner commented about Johann Strauss Sr. At the beginning of a new waltz, this demon of the Viennese musical spirit shook like a Pythian priestess. Veritable groans of ecstasy raised the public's worship for this magic violinist to almost bewildering heights of frenzy. It's putting a pretty fine point on this craze for the waltz led by Johann Strauss Sr. His son, Johann Strauss Jr., built on his father's success. He was a rock star of his age. He and his orchestra toured Europe and America. He got so many requests from female admirers for a lock of his profuse black hair that he had his valet send clippings from his black Labrador poodle to those ladies determined to get a piece of the action. Appropriately, for a composer who was nicknamed the Waltz King, here's his gilded statue erected in his honor in a city park in Vienna. Well, besides music and dance, the good life in Vienna has always involved good eating. Gutes Essen in German. Classic Viennese dish is Wiener Schnitzel, veal schnitzel, a thin, breaded, pan-fried veal cutlet adorned only by one slice of lemon. And anyone who's in Vienna knows the Zuckertorte. This dense chocolate cake has a thin layer of apricot jam in the middle, coated with dark chocolate icing, traditionally served with unsweetened whipped cream on the side. The original Zuckertorte can be purchased only from one place in Vienna, the Hotel Zocker, where it originated. In fact, several times the hotel has had to sue competitors who tried to imitate the Zuckertorte in their commercial recipes. Good drinking, gutes Trinken, is also essential to the Viennese lifestyle. You might indulge yourself, especially at Horrige, like this one shown here. These are small open-air taverns in Vienna specializing in new white wine, ideally produced from grapes grown right on the premises. The most popular location for Horrige is in the suburb of Grinzing. And an evening in Grinzing led to one of the most festive experiences of my honeymoon. And I'll provide details of that event on request. But suffice it to say, the power of this fresh, new white wine at a Horrige is unprecedented. At the end of the 19th century, winds of change are beginning to blow across Vienna and certainly across Europe as well. During the long calm before the storm, the Emperor Franz Joseph, shown here, restores the monarchy. Popular at first, as you can see from the painting, he looks like everyone's favorite kindly uncle. He commissions grand public buildings, like the State Opera House on the Ringstrasse, shown here in a turn-of-the-century photograph. But his empire is coming apart, especially with rising nationalism among the many constituent peoples within the Austrian Empire. Not only Austrians, but Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, Poles, and so on. Franz Joseph spends most of his 68-year reign trying to hold his empire together. He's also beset by a fair degree of personal tragedy. His wife goes slightly mad and is assassinated. His only son kills himself along with his mistress, his son's mistress. And France installs Franz Joseph's brother Maximilian for a short time as the Emperor of Mexico. Later, Maximilian is executed by the legitimate Republican government of Mexico. This new age in Vienna is seen in a couple of turn-of-the-century figures. First on the left is Sigmund Freud, Viennese neurologist. I have Vietnam on the mind because at some point that will become a future program as well, as soon as I'm able to take a tour to Vietnam. But Sigmund Freud was a Viennese neurologist, the father of psychiatry, not accepted in academic circles in Vienna. He was not able to get a university professorship until the age of 46, and to do that, he had to have one of his former patients, who happened to be a baroness as well, bribe the education ministry. One problem for Freud was that he saw through the Viennese hypocrisy in matters of sex, showed what was really going on under the respectable surface of Viennese life. He was also Jewish, as was the gentleman in the middle, Theodor Herzl, Viennese journalist and founder of modern political Zionism. And on the right is a noted painting by Gustav Klimt, Viennese artist who led what was called the secessionist movement, a rebellion against the conservative art establishment of Vienna. Klimt's exotic decorative style can be seen in this painting. It's a portrait from 1907, portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. She was the wife of a wealthy industrialist in Vienna. The painting was willed to the Austrian State Gallery after his death, stolen by the Nazis during World War II. And in 2006, an Austrian court ruled that the painting should be returned to Adele's niece, Maria Altmann. The painting was subsequently sold at auction for $135 million, the most expensive painting in the world at that time. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen this entire story dramatized in the 2015 movie Woman in Gold, with Helen Mirren playing the role of Maria Altmann. Trouble starts for Franz Josef, real trouble starts late in his reign. In 1914, his nephew and heir, Franz Ferdinand, is assassinated in Bosnia, in the capital of Bosnia, Sarajevo, one of the constituent territories within the Austrian Empire, assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. This triggers a series of cascading alliances leading within 6 weeks to the outbreak of World War I. At the end of the war, the Habsburg Empire is dissolved after its 640-year run. The Prime Minister of France, Georges Clemenceau, remarked, "Austria is what is left over from the Habsburg Empire, and Vienna then becomes the capital of nothing, in a sense." Out of the devastation of World War I emerges totalitarianism in Europe. Vienna pays the price when Hitler annexes all of Austria into the Third Reich in 1938, an event known as the Anschluss. Austria then, from 1938, becomes a province of Germany. Some of you may remember the scene in the movie, The Sound of Music, towards the end, when one of the children, referring to a Nazi rally at which they were to perform, part of a musical festival with swastikas strung from the ramparts. One of the children says, "That flag with the big black spider is making people nervous." No kidding. Well, this photograph on the left suggests the grief with which some Viennese greeted the Anschluss, the absorption into Hitler's realm. But at the same time, when the German troops entered the city, thousands of flag-waving celebrants lined the streets. 200,000 Viennese came out to cheer Hitler when he spoke from the balcony of the Hofburg Palace. But the Viennese and the Austrians will soon change their tune. 245,000 Austrians died in the German army, and out of the 200,000 Jews originally living in Vienna alone, 60,000 died in the Nazi camps. Most of the rest escaped to the West, including Freud. One native of Vienna who was determined to fight back, the actress Hedy Lamarr, shown on the right. Early in the war, she got together with a friend of hers, a fellow composer by the name of Georges Antheil, developed a novel radio guidance system for Allied torpedoes. She was self-taught as an inventor. Her technology was not adopted by the Navy until the 1950s, but in 2014, Hedy Lamarr posthumously inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame and given an honorary grave in the Central Cemetery of Vienna. During the war, Vienna was heavily bombed by the Allies. Afterward, the devastated city was occupied by Soviet troops as well as US, British, and French troops. There you can see some Soviets sightseeing at the Hofburg Palace during the war. In the decades Since the war, Austria and the Viennese have been slow to come to grips with their Nazi past. Kurt Waldheim, shown on the left, he was prominent in the 1970s and 1980s as the Secretary General of the United Nations and President of Austria, eventually faced harsh criticism over his membership in the Nazi Party during World War II and his service in the German army. The Soviets and all the occupying powers finally withdrew from Vienna after Austria pledged permanent neutrality in international affairs. And Vienna has capitalized on that stance by becoming a center for a host of UN agencies. Shown on the right is a complex of UN offices known as UN City in Vienna. But enough of international politics. For most of us, Vienna remains all about gaiety and music. So I'm going to close with a short excerpt from a 2016 concert by André Rieu. Rieu is Dutch, but he and his performers, I think, do a fabulous job with a Johann Strauss waltz, Wiener Blut, Viennese Spirit. Well, I hope you enjoy that. I'm sure the lucky couple there in the foreground enjoyed that experience. Maybe that was prearranged. I'm not really sure of the backstory of this clip. In any event, that concludes our tour of Vienna. I'm looking now to see if we have any questions. No questions? All right, next week, well, I've already introduced the topic of celebrated white wine of Vienna. Next week, we're going to be delving more deeply into the history of both of our favorite adult beverages, beer and wine. They have a fascinating history extending back about 10,000 years. So we'll begin at the very beginning, and in the course of an hour or less, we'll carry you all the way up to the present. Talk about some of the fads and commercial exploits in the beer and wine industries today. So hope to see you here, same time, next Wednesday, with a short history of beer and wine.